welcome back to Groundwork Foundations, where we build strong foundations for healing, growth, and authenticity. I'm Angie, and today we're diving deeper into the mental health effects of forced displacement and generational trauma. If you missed part one, make sure to check it out because today we have a special guest who will help us unpack these crucial conversations.
Hey everyone, I'm Jess, and I'm excited to continue this discussion, especially as we explore how historical trauma continues to impact communities today. And joining us for this conversation is Gabriel Seghetto, a graduate student at Rice University who has been working extensively with slavevoyages.org. Welcome, Gabriel.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Gabriel, we're so grateful to have you here. To start off, can you share with us what initially sparked, your interest in researching the transatlantic and intra-American slave trades?
Yeah, sure. It all goes back to 2016, but if I really wanted to dig deep into my personal history, I would say it begins before I was even born. As I told you, um, I was born into a mixed race family, and so from a very early age, I was made aware of that family history and that sparked the initial interest in me.
Mhm.
Um, but it took me years till I made it to undergrad, um, where I began to study the history of Africa and Black history in the African diaspora. Um, from there, my passion only grew. So I majored in history in 2019. I enrolled into my master's in 2021, and I completed my degree after writing a thesis on the identities of people of mixed ancestry in 18th century Angola. And I joined Rice recently in 2024 to pursue my PhD. So I think I can say my fascination is a product of my family history, my identity, and ever since I was 12, I've decided to try and make a living out of it. Um, so yeah, that's a little bit of my background and how I got started.
Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing all that with us and how you've come here, As you've worked with the data on slavevoyages.org, what are some common misconceptions about the transatlantic slave trade? And um, what does what has your research challenged?
Mhm. Um, Before I directly address that, I think I should add that for 7 years, I was a teacher. I taught grade school from 6 through 12. And that gave me the opportunity to teach Black history to all levels of basic education, almost all levels of basic education. And I say that some of the misconceptions about the slave trade are mostly the origin of the enslaved. Um, Most people tend to assume that enslaved Africans, they all hail from uh, one particular region, when in fact uh, they were embarked in various ports across the African coast. I'm talking about places from West Africa to West Central Africa. Um,
Mm.
People also have the misconception about the uh, the ports of disembarkation. When we speak of the Black diaspora or the African diaspora, um, we are talking about significant event that spans time and space. So although the great or the majority of enslaved Africans they made it here to the Americas, we also have a population, uh, quite significant one, that disembarked in Europe, Spain, Portugal, southern ports, um, in Italy. So let's just say that this history goes beyond the Americas, although uh, lots of turning points happen here. Um, Also, the role of the United States in the slave trade. Um, Most of the people who have dedicated their careers, or people who simply are curious, may know this already, but the U.S. did not import a lot of people. Not a lot of ships came from Africa to here. Think estimates put around 400 to 5 sorry 400,000 to 500,000 people who were disembarked directly from Africa. So although the US was a major player in the trade, not a lot of people hail from Africa directly. People had to be brought to these Caribbean slave markets where they would be purchased by some major slaveholder and brought over here.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
Okay.
Okay, that adds a different spin to it. They a lot of times what we envision is like the movie where we had Amistad, and that was like the middle passage, and boom, there we go. And that's what most people envision. So you've kind of added in another layer to it. To There were other stops in there before they even came,
Hmm.
which is probably where a lot of the mixing in culture and genetics happened as well along the way.
Oh yeah.
So, what key insights, with that being said, have you gained from working with this data that you think the general public often overlooks?
Mhm. Um, I think people. I don't consider this a detail that people overlook because it's not widely discussed at all. Um, Maybe I am using some hyperbole here. Not that it's not discussed at all, but it's something that it can be easily neglected. Is the invisibility of enslaved people.
Mhm.
Um, when you're trying to reconstruct the past, or you're trying to make an accurate um, approximation, um, one of the first roadblocks that, as a student of history, you encounter is the sources, the primary sources. So we're talking about court records, wills by slaveholders, um, bills of sale, etc. Although these sources they register the existence of enslaved people, many times we can't find information about them as individuals.
Mm.
So, for instance, in my work with the slave voyages database as a grad student, it is my job to compile data. And right now, I'm working with one small segment of the intra-American trade. Because just to tie this back into the previous question, this is another misconception. A lot of people assume that we only had trade in people from Africa, but when in fact a lot of regions across the Atlantic on this side of the pond, uh, they were connected through trade. So you have lots of people coming from ports in the Americas to somewhere else in this continent.
So you're saying
Yeah,
that there's trade not just transatlantic, but also in between the Americas or different parts of the Americas.
precisely,
So like South
precisely.
America or up further Canada area around the coasts and things.
Yeah, just to give you an example, soon the slave voyages will uh, launch a new tab on the website called Texas Bound, where we explore the trade and people bound to Texas. So you have many um, records showing people coming from New Orleans, for example, and disembarking in some port city here in Texas. That would be an example of intra-American slave trade. But we also have instances when people they were embarked somewhere in, say, South America, and then uh, they are sailed off to North America, for example. Uh, in As I was saying, in my work with the database, I've been covering the slave trade in Northeast Brazil, and many times I found registers describing this kind of intra-American slave voyage.
Mhm.
So digital archives like slavevoyages.org are changing how we study and engage with history. How do you think tools like these are reshaping our understanding of slavery?
Mhm. I like to remind people that although this slave voyages database is an extraordinary website, an extraordinary resource, it is a tool. A tool alone doesn't change your perspective on history, but how you use it. So with the information that is available on the website, you can present it in ways that make people see it as more than just numbers on a data sheet. For example, a couple of years ago, I think it was Slate magazine or Vox, I'm not sure. They released this interactive map where we see the voyages, each voyage being represented by a small dot that hovers across the map. And I remember that back in 2019, that, you know, took people by surprise because we followed the trade from the mid 16th century to through the um, mid, late 19th century, and so as time says, we see the number of dots crossing the Atlantic increase, and the further we move in time, the the volume of dots thickened. So that gives us an idea that the trade did not happen in an homogeneous way, it changed over time because that's the thing about history. Everything is connected. So many things that were unfolded in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, they impacted the intensity and the frequency of the trade and the slave voyages. Um, yes.
All right. So, with documenting the histories of enslaved people comes challenges with it. So, what are some of the biggest obstacles in this work? Whether it's gaps in records, ethical considerations, or even emotional barriers.
Mhm, mhm. Um, One thing I like to say is I don't really do history of the slave trade. Yeah, by the way, that's when once you make it to grad school, they ask you what kind of history you do. So I don't do history of slave trade. I do Black history, um, because I'm interested in understanding how this category, Black, came into existence, and the different meanings it has assumed over time. So that is something we have to grapple with when studying the trade. We got to remember that first and foremost, these were people, and that very basic idea is going to guide your work, or at least it guides my work. And so I need to overcome with the lack of individual details, as I said, but also I have to grapple with things like uh, these Nick monikers that they sort of erase the origins of some of these enslaved peoples. Um, Many times when you are documenting and cataloging slave voyages, you often find people with the same name. So if you're trying to trace somebody's individual history, uh, that will be a frequent challenge to deal with. Um,
Wow. And
yeah.
what do you do in that case?
Well, if you're asking about um, what we do in terms of cataloging, we catalog all the names we find um, related to a certain voyage. But if you are asking what the researcher does, it will depend on the scope of the research.
Mm,
Um, in the case of the intra-American slave trade, which is the work I'm doing currently, when you're lucky, you can find the name of the enslaved and the name of the slaveholder, and that there is a huge difference between uh, naming patterns of enslaved people and naming patterns of free people. Free people have a name, middle name, last name. Enslaved people, more often than not, they only have a first name.
okay.
Um, but when you have the slaveholder's name and the enslaved's name, it gets easier to distinguish between different peoples with people with the same name.
Okay. You've interacted with other researchers, historians, and people engaging with this content, and all the histories of each person from your observations. How do people typically respond, whether in body language or unspoken reactions when discussing this research?
Yeah, well, you have everything from astonishment, to admiration for enslaved people's perseverance, to anger, everything. One of my first, or at least the most meaningful reaction I can think of many, but there is just one that stay with me. It's W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black man to get a PhD at Harvard. I remember in one of his books, he describes with admiration the people who endured the Middle Passage, and he also uh, speaks with pride of his connection with Africa. When I first read it, I don't recall the exact words, but I recall how I reacted. I almost broke into tears because that was a very beautiful passage. That was how I felt when I was getting started. I read this passage in 2016. But speaking of people who I know personally, um, I have people who speak passionately about it, and a historian I met recently uh, even went on to say that although he takes his work seriously and conducts a historical survey with objectivity, he can't help but see the slave trade as this great evil. Um, to speak of myself in present days, um, I still get shocked by the violence because sometimes I encounter some very graphic descriptions, maybe not in my work with the intra-American slave trade, but doing coursework in grad school, uh, where we read some books that quote primary sources, and you see some harrowing um, descriptions. And at the same time, when I see people's perseverance and I see how people have been able to make sense out of senseless violence, I can't help but admire because that makes me think about how I got here, right? Um, I'll, even though my ancestors will never meet me, um, it was necessary that this chain of people had to come before me so I could be here.
Right.
So, with that thought in mind, on a more personal level, how has engaging with this history overall impacted your own mental health? As a researcher, and someone with ancestral ties to this history, um, what has this journey been like for you?
Uh, I say that I I reflected about my own identity when I got started. As I told you, I come from a mixed race family, and so that makes you question who you are. Um, so long before I got involved in the slave writers database, that was the first kind of question I had to think about. Um, But I think over time, as I said, I came to become more and more, I wouldn't say comfortable, but I became more used to some of the kinds of experiences, good and bad, I find in primary sources. Um, but most of all, I have this very optimistic, positive um, perspective about life in general. And so I try not to let these these horrible things, the horrible aspect, uh, uh, creep up and take hold of my mind. Most of all, I try to look at these instances of people um, trying their best to make it to freedom again, or to construct or to build something that outlasts um, slavery. Um, before I joined the meeting, I was reading a book by Jane Landers. I think she's now a retired professor at Vanderbilt. It's called Black Society in Spanish Florida. So although she addresses slavery, because after all, Spanish Florida, just like anywhere else in the Americas, had slaves. Um, what what grabbed me about this book is how people who were formerly enslaved, they found a shelter, they created a sanctuary town in the heart of Spanish Florida, and they made something out of it. Um, so his admiration, his fascination for the resilience of people despite this this savage system of oppression.
Yeah. Um, you know, just like um, making the best of circumstances and just um, survival, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, we're running a little bit short on time here, but we've got about 7 minutes left, guys.
Yes, true. Okay, so could you tell us more about how navigating this work has shaped your understanding of your own cultural identity? Have you um, found any resource that has helped you manage um, the times when this research may have had more of an emotional or psychological toll?
Mhm. So I throughout all these years, I've been lucky enough to find people who um, sort of similar background and share the same interest for history, for Black history, and so uh, talking and trying to make sense out of these conversations has been quite helpful over the years. And that's for how I understand my cultural identity. Well, I acknowledge that I have this mixed cultural background, and I've been very proud of both sides of the family. And I see that one side does not exclude the other, not at all. So I'm here. Um, but I think mostly speaking in not only talking about work, but about your ancestry, about how it ties into the diaspora with friends, with people who are receptive is quite helpful. This very interview, for example, is one of these moments where I get to share thoughts about it all. As I was as I was telling Angela before we started recording, the the factual questions were so easy to prepare, but many of these personal questions, there's no way of, at least to me, there is no way to get ready for them. As you can give me as much time as possible, and I still wouldn't haven't be able to write something down. So I'm answering all of this, you know, out of heart.
Mhm. I mean, naturally, this work does hold a deep emotional weight. And how do you balance the need for scholarly objectivity with, the personal and collective emotional impact of these histories?
Mm. Oh, I guess it will be no surprise to anyone when I say that I consider slavery an evil, um, and racial violence and a plague. Um, but despite what I think, I'm aware that the profession requires objectivity, because the whole idea of history is you you try to find sources, and with the information you extract from these sources, you try to make sense of the past in an intelligible narrative. So that requires the the skill of reading different perspectives. So from the enslaved to the slaver's perspective, um, you got to read it all, and you got to understand the positions from where people made what they did. Um, so while I have all these personal convictions, um, still gotta sit down and process all this information without trying to read it teleologically, but trying to get the picture of what was happening at the time, and how people perceived what was going on. Because these are two different things, right? One thing is to you as a present day observer looking back at the past, and you know what happens. The other thing is to step into the shoes of historical figures, and try to get a sense of how they viewed the world, and how these conflicting views, they informed all their actions.
Okay, well, what we can do is pause here for a moment and then we'll be right back, okay?
See you soon. All right, so we're back. In what ways, Gabriel, do you think this project contributes to broader conversations around racial justice and historical accountability?
Oh, I can give you a very radical example. Um, so here in the U.S., there's a group, or maybe I should call it an organization called Middle Passage Project. Their website is middlepassageproject.com. And essentially, they use the slave voyages database to map out important ports of disembarkation, or pretty much any port of disembarkation here in the US. And they put up signs indicating that that is a port where enslaved people were disembarked in. That is an example of historical accountability, at least here. That highlights a place that is linked to the slave trade, to the transatlantic slave trade. Of course, that is just one example. As long as we can make people aware of the transatlantic slave trade, of the multiple actors involved in it through teaching, um, or podcasting, or writing books, or any other effort, um, we're only expanding the conversation on racial justice and historical accountability. Um, it's just, one uh, short step. We still have to see where this conversation is going to take us down the line. But I think initiatives like the Middle Passage Project are fantastic examples of what can be done.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I'm loving the documentation of putting the signs up and stuff like this. It makes me feel like I need to take a little road trip so that I can go see some of this, and but finally, for students and researchers or anyone looking to engage with digital history projects like slavevoyages.org, what advice would you give them?
Take your time to read through the website. You can only get to appreciate what digital history projects mean and their impact when you take the time to navigate through the website and understand the resources. Um, Make sure that you find everything you can about the people behind a digital history project's development, because many of these people are, researchers, professors, grad students, uh, teachers, high school teachers, middle school teachers, and these projects, they are only one little particle of the broader work these people do. So uh, find their names, these people's names, and from there try to find as much as you can about their contributions to the study of history in general, and Black history, and the history of the slave trade in particular. Remember, tools like the slave voyages, they are just that. They are indispensable tools, but you got to make sense out of them. And so you need to hear as many voices from as many people involved in its development as possible.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for being here. Today's discussion has been powerful, and it's only the beginning. The lasting impact of forced displacement is real, but through knowledge, conversation, healing, we break the cycles of historical trauma, and we can grow and find joy and what we are now, that we are now able to be in the present.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of
Yes,
course.
thank you so very much. And hopefully we will hear from you again. Any updates that you might have. And it is okay for us to post these sites for the viewers, right?
But yeah, I mean, it's a public project, so
Okay.
I mean, you not just the Middle Passage, but the Slave Voyages is a free, open resource. So yeah.
And before I let you go, are there any other digital sites or anything that are beneficial for someone like in this research? Because you mentioned Middle Passage Project.com. I think I got that right, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. There are, but I'll have to send them to you later. For one simple reason, I forgot their names. I had them saved here somewhere. Um, so there is a John Hopkins University professor named Jessica Marie Johnson. She's a very important scholar, and she has a website about New Orleans. And I know that Brown University professor also has been working on an indigenous slavery database. Um, y- don't give me the look. Um, I know that our focus here are enslaved Africans, but indigenous slavery is another um, impactful event in the history of the Americas, and there are scholars working to expand our knowledge about that.
I mean, the look that I gave, um, the look that I gave was very much a genuine heat of interest occurring because, as I've told you before, I am an extreme history just lover. And so when you tell me things like that, it makes me happy and smile. It takes me to my happy place because it's something else that I can dig my claws into and just, really enjoy. Knowledge is so important to me, and I think it's important for mental health as well, especially with topics like these, because the more we know, it gives us more
Mhm.
avenues to figure out how to heal.
Sure.
So, and it gives us more opportunities possibly for some form of closure or at least understanding. So I get excited when I hear different resources and things that can be utilized. So yes, but thank you so very much, and I look forward to the information that you send. And if you have no questions for us, we will go ahead and conclude this.
Okay, no, I think that sums it up. Again, I can't be thankful enough for sitting through these long minutes listening to me. That means a lot. Thank you.
No
We have something
problems.
interesting to say.
Yes,
We
we
have to know
enjoyed
our
it.
history. Um,
Yeah.
it's a lot of people have a hard time listening to this stuff, but
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
it affects us whether we know it or not. And
Yeah,
by
true.
knowing, we can then grow from it. We can then, you know, heal and move forward.
Hopefully. Um, I hope people understand that this is not just about slavery. Slavery is a crucial moment, in history, in I mean, transatlantic slavery is a crucial moment in history, but there's so much more than just that. Um, to to borrow a term from uh, Professor Vincent Brown, maybe one of the aspects that are most important about the history of transatlantic slavery. And yeah, as I emphasize transatlantic, I know that some people out there think that we try to oversimplify narratives, but no, I am aware there are many forms of slavery out there. But Professor Vincent Brown said that the enslaved, those who are enslaved um, during the years of the transatlantic slave trade, they struggle to make sense out of their experiences. So that is what we can call the politics of survival. You try to make sense out of the horrific violences of captivity.
Yes. The violence that occurred is a bit much to try to digest at times. But it is a very necessary history to observe. And like you said, those that came before us, they're the reason we're here. So again, thank you so, so very much for sharing all of this information with us, for sharing your personal impact.
It's been a pleasure hearing from you.
Yes,
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
thank you. And we will be back soon. And we're back.
Research has shown that trauma isn't just emotional, it can actually be passed down biologically. Studies on descendants of Holocaust survivors and enslaved people reveal higher cortisol levels and an increased risk of PTSD. This means that the fear, survival mindset, and hypervigilance that protected our ancestors in times of crisis can still be present in us today, even if we've never lived through those exact experiences.
And we see this reflected in psychological patterns. Many BIPOC communities struggle with fear of instability, distrust of institutions, and a survival-based mindset that can make it difficult to rest, trust, or feel truly safe. These inherited responses are not just personal, they're historical and systemic.
This generational trauma is reinforced by real world challenges, economic disparities, systemic racism, and the ongoing stigma around mental health in communities of color. We've also seen the effects of historical medical exploitation, like the Tuskegee experiments, which has left many Black and Indigenous folks deeply mistrustful of the healthcare systems.
And when you add the identity struggles caused by forced disconnection from cultural roots, whether through colonization, displacement, or assimilation pressures, it makes healing even more complicated. But that's why conversations like this are so important.
Yeah. Understanding this history is the first step towards healing. Recognizing these generational wounds can be truly transformative. And but healing isn't just about acknowledging the past. It's about reclaiming tools that help us move forward. That's why culturally affirming mental health practices matter. working with therapists who understand intergenerational trauma, reconnecting with ancestral healing traditions, and building community support are essential steps.
And therapy, especially in BIPOC and immigrant communities, needs to be normalized. Seeking help isn't weakness, it's breaking cycles, it's honoring our ancestors' resilience, and it makes space for joy and growth. There are many ways to incorporate culturally affirming healing. One of the ways, culturally responsive therapy, where you find therapists who understand your background and lived experiences. Again, storytelling and oral traditions. So it's using spoken word poetry or family history to process emotions and reclaim your narrative. Then you have spiritual ancestral practices, and that includes meditation, prayer, altar work, or ceremonies that strengthen cultural identity. And we have community healing circles, which is engaging in support groups or talking circles to share experiences and gain wisdom.
Or creative expression, art, music, dance, and writing as powerful outlets for healing and self-discovery. Nature-based healing, spending time in nature, gardening, or participating in water rituals to restore balance. Activism and advocacy, using your voice to challenge systemic oppression and foster resilience. Healing isn't one size fits all, so explore what resonates with you. When we embrace these approaches, we reclaim wellness on our own terms. And if you found this conversation valuable, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's continue building spaces for healing, growth, and resilience.
To give a quick recap before I do the recap, when you mentioned the water rituals to restore balance, I have mentioned this before, I'm sure, but I'll mention it again. I love grounding in the ocean. It's just something about being out in nature and letting the waves wash over me that helps to recenter me. So yes, definitely. It doesn't have to be the ocean though, because everybody's not next to an ocean. But if you have lakes, rivers, or any other form of body of water that you can get to, that helps. But to recap, voluntary immigrants do face challenges, but forced displacement leaves lasting wounds across generations. And recognizing this history, it helps us to break cycles of trauma and reclaim mental wellness. So, what's your family migration story? How has it shaped your identity and your mental health?
If you found this valuable, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let's keep the conversation going and build spaces for healing and growth. We'll see you next time on Groundwork Foundations.
Bye.